My name is Caroline Bennett, and this is the story of the woman I blamed for destroying my family until the day she saved my daughter's life. If you had asked me 3 years ago who I hated most in this world, I would have answered without hesitation. Today, if someone asks me who I owe the greatest debt to, my answer is the very same person. I know that doesn't make sense yet, but stay with me. Some stories don't begin with the truth. They begin with a lie we spend years believing. For 22 years, my husband David and I had what most people would have called an ordinary marriage. We weren't the couple who posted romantic photos online or surprised each other with extravagant vacations. We argued over whose turn it was to take the trash out, forgot anniversaries every now and then, and spent Friday nights watching old detective shows, while our daughter Emma complained that we had become an old married couple. I used to laugh when she said that because I thought becoming ordinary with someone was the greatest achievement a marriage could reach. Ordinary meant safe. Ordinary meant he would still be sitting across from me at breakfast 20 years from now. The illusion shattered in the least dramatic place imaginable: a supermarket. David had called earlier that afternoon to say he would be working late with a client, so I stopped to buy coffee on my way home. As I reached for a bag from the top shelf, I heard someone laugh. It was David's laugh, the one that always escaped him when he genuinely forgot the rest of the world existed. I turned instinctively, expecting to find him with a coworker. Instead, I found him smiling at another woman as they pushed a shopping cart together, debating over which cookies to buy like they'd done it 100 times before. When he looked up and saw me, the color drained from his face. I didn't need an explanation. Some silences tell the entire story. I don't remember walking out of the supermarket. I don't remember unlocking my car or driving home. The only thing I remember clearly is gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my wedding ring left a deep mark in my finger. I kept replaying the image in my head, the way they laughed together, the ease between them, the way she had reached into the cart and teased him over something as ordinary as cookies. It wasn't passion that broke my heart. It was familiarity. They had already built routines. While I was still believing we were sharing a life, he had quietly started another one. David came home just after 8. He opened the front door as if it were any other evening, setting his keys in the ceramic bowl by the entrance, the same bowl Emma had made for him in middle school. For a brief second, I wondered if he would pretend nothing had happened. Instead, he looked at me sitting alone at the dining table and knew the pretending was over. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I looked at him for a long moment before asking the only question that mattered. "Who is she?" He sat down across from me, but he couldn't meet my eyes. "Her name is Natalie." It hurt more that she had a name than I expected. A name meant she wasn't just a mistake. She was a person, someone he'd spent enough time with to know her favorite coffee, her birthday, the stories from her childhood. I suddenly realized there were pieces of my husband that no longer belonged to me. "Do you love her?" The silence that followed was all the answer I needed. "I never meant for this to happen," he finally whispered. I almost laughed. Nobody ever means for it to happen. They just keep making small decisions until one day they're standing in a supermarket with another woman, wondering how they ended up there. "What about Emma?" I asked. "Have you thought about what this does to her?" His face tightened. "I'll always be her father." That's not what I asked. He rubbed both hands over his face, looking older than he had that morning. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, Caroline." I believed him. That was the frightening part. He genuinely didn't know. The next morning we told Emma. She was 16, old enough to understand the words, but too young to understand how people who once loved each other could become strangers overnight. She listened without interrupting, her eyes moving from me to David, and back again. Finally, she stood up. "Is it because of another woman?" Neither of us answered. She nodded slowly. "I knew it." David looked stunned. "You knew?" Emma shrugged, though I could see tears gathering in her eyes. "I didn't know for sure, but every time Mom asked if you wanted to watch a movie, you said you were tired. Every time I asked you to help me practice driving, You suddenly had work to finish. You stopped being here long before you stopped living here." She looked at her father for another second. "I just hoped I was wrong." Then she walked upstairs and quietly closed her bedroom door. It was the last real conversation David and Emma had for almost a year. The divorce moved faster than I expected. David rented an apartment across town, and within 2 months, everyone seemed to know he was living with Natalie. Friends called to check on me. Neighbors offered awkward smiles, and complete strangers suddenly looked at me with a kind of sympathy that made me want to disappear. I hated Natalie with every part of me. Not because I knew her, because I didn't. It was easier to imagine her as a heartless woman than to accept that the man I had trusted for 22 years had made his own choices. Blaming her allowed me to avoid asking a much harder question. Had I ever really known my husband at all? One afternoon, while picking Emma up from school, I saw them together for the first time since the supermarket. David and Natalie were sitting outside a small cafe. He was talking with his hands, the way he always did when he was excited, and she was laughing so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. Emma saw them too. Before I could say a word, she opened the car door and started walking toward them. "Emma!" I shouted. She didn't stop. David looked up just as she reached the table. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Emma looked directly at Natalie. "I hope he never does to you what he did to my mom." The cafe fell silent. Natalie's smile vanished instantly. David stood up, embarrassed, but Emma was already walking back toward the car. As she climbed into the passenger seat, I noticed her hands were shaking. I wanted to tell her she shouldn't have said those words. Instead, I reached across the center console and held her hand all the way home. Neither of us realized that one day, the woman Emma had just cursed would be the one refusing to leave her side in a hospital room. And when that day came, everything I believed about love, betrayal, and forgiveness would be turned upside down. Life settled into a rhythm I never asked for. David moved in with Natalie. Emma refused to answer his calls, and I buried myself in work because it was easier than sitting alone in a house that still smelled like the man who had walked away. People have this idea that heartbreak is loud, that you spend your days crying into pillows or throwing photographs into the fireplace. Mine was painfully quiet. It was eating dinner across from an empty chair. It was reaching for a second coffee mug every morning before remembering I only needed one. It was hearing Emma laugh less and less until our home felt like a place where everyone whispered. About 8 months after the divorce, I was leaving the grocery store when I saw Natalie again. She was standing near the entrance, staring at the flowers outside, as if she couldn't decide whether to buy them. I almost turned around. The last person I wanted to see was the woman I'd blamed for dismantling my family. But before I could walk away, she noticed me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, to my surprise, she walked toward me. "I know you probably hate me," she said quietly, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted to say I'm sorry." I tightened my grip on my shopping bags. "Sorry doesn't give my daughter her family back." She lowered her eyes. "I know." "No," I replied, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. "You really don't." She nodded, accepting every word without arguing. "You're right, I don't. But if it matters, I didn't know he was married when we first met. He told me he was separated. By the time I learned the truth, I was already in love with him. I convinced myself he would leave eventually anyway. It was easier to believe him than to admit I'd become someone I never wanted to be. I wanted to dismiss her explanation. I wanted to tell her she deserved every sleepless night she had ever had. But when I looked at her face, I didn't see triumph. I saw exhaustion. The kind that settles into a person's eyes after they've spent too long pretending they're happy. "I have to go," I said. She nodded. I understand. As I walked away, she called after me one last time. For what it's worth, Emma seems like a wonderful girl. I stopped for half a second but didn't turn around. How did she know that? The answer came later that evening. Emma walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of textbooks and casually mentioned Dad brought Natalie to one of my school debates last month. I stared at her. He what? She shrugged. I didn't ask them to come. They just showed up. And you never told me. I didn't think it mattered. It mattered. Because for the first time, I realized something that made me deeply uncomfortable. Natalie hadn't been trying to replace me. She had been trying to know my daughter. I still wasn't ready to forgive her. But for the first time since the divorce, I wasn't completely sure she was the villain I'd made her out to be. The moment she saw me, she stood up immediately. I was just leaving. I looked from her to Emma, completely confused. What are you doing here? Before Natalie could answer, Emma spoke in a weak voice. Mom, she saved me. I frowned. What do you mean? Emma took a slow breath. The other driver ran the red light. I was trapped inside the car. She swallowed, wincing as she moved. Natalie was driving behind me. She stopped, climbed through the broken window, and pulled me out before the car caught fire. I stared at Natalie. She looked down at the floor. It wasn't a big deal, she whispered. The nurse, who had been checking Emma's chart, looked up. It was a very big deal. The vehicle started smoking within minutes. If she hadn't acted as quickly as she did, this could have ended very differently. The words echoed through the room. This woman. The woman I'd spent nearly a year blaming for everything, had risked her own life to save my daughter's. I wanted to thank her. I wanted to apologize. Instead, all I could manage was, why? Natalie finally looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. Because she's Emma, and for the first time since I'd met her. I realized she wasn't asking me to forgive her. She had simply done what any person who loved my daughter would have done. For the next 2 days, I barely left Emma's hospital room. Between doctors, nurses, insurance forms, and worried family members, there was always something demanding my attention. Yet every time I looked up, I noticed the same thing. Natalie was there. She never tried to make herself the center of attention. She brought Emma fresh pajamas from home, replaced the flowers when they began to wilt, and quietly disappeared whenever she sensed I needed time alone with my daughter. On the third evening, I found her sitting alone outside the hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhausted that sleep couldn't fix. For several moments, I debated walking past her. Old habits die hard. But something inside me had shifted the moment Emma told me who had pulled her from that wrecked car. "Can I sit?" I asked. She looked up, clearly surprised, then nodded. For a while, neither of us spoke. Hospitals have a strange way of making silence feel less awkward. Around us, doctors hurried down hallways. Families cried quietly in waiting rooms. And somewhere, a newborn let out its first cry. Life and loss existed under the same roof, and suddenly our complicated history felt much smaller. "I never thanked you," I finally said. "You don't have to." "I do." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't save her because I expected anything in return." "I know." Another silence settled between us before I asked the question that had been bothering me ever since the accident. "Why were you even there?" She smiled faintly. David forgot Emma had an early dismissal that day. She called him because her car was making a strange noise a few weeks ago, and I'd told her if she ever felt uncomfortable driving, she could call either of us. When she texted to say she was leaving school, I happened to be nearby, so I stayed a few cars behind without telling her. I just wanted to make sure she got home safely. I blinked. You followed her? She nodded, almost embarrassed. It probably sounds strange. No, I whispered. It sounds protective. She looked away, her eyes suddenly filling with tears. I know I'll never be anything to her. I wasn't trying to replace you, Caroline. I never wanted that. She stopped, struggling to find the right words. I cared about her because she mattered to David. And somewhere along the way, she started mattering to me, too. I studied her face for a long moment. There wasn't a trace of manipulation, no performance, just quiet honesty. Then she said something I never expected to hear. Can I tell you something? I nodded. The day I found out David was still married, I tried to leave. My heart skipped. He begged me to stay. He told me your marriage had been over for years and that you were only together until Emma finished high school. He said the divorce papers were already being prepared. She gave a bitter laugh. A month later, I accidentally found your family Christmas photo on his phone. That's when I realized he'd lied to me from the beginning. I stared at her, unable to speak. I should have walked away then, she continued. Instead, I believed every promise he made after that. I kept telling myself that if I just waited a little longer, everything would become honest. She looked directly into my eyes. I wasn't stealing a happy marriage. Her voice cracked. I was being lied to by the same man who was lying to you. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I realized David hadn't broken one woman's heart. He had broken two. Emma came home from the hospital a week later with her arm in a cast and strict instructions to rest. For the first few days, I barely let her out of my sight. I found myself checking on her while she slept, listening for the sound of her breathing as though I could somehow protect her from everything life still had planned. Losing someone is terrifying, but almost losing them changes you in ways you never expect. It teaches you how fragile ordinary days really are. One Saturday afternoon, Emma walked into the kitchen holding 2 mugs of tea. She placed one in front of me before sitting down with an unusually serious expression. Can I ask you something? Of course. Are you ever going to stop hating Natalie? The question caught me completely off guard. I don't know. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I used to hate her too. The words stung because I knew exactly where she'd learned that hatred. But I don't anymore. I looked at my daughter, waiting for her to explain. When I was trapped in the car, I couldn't open my door. I remember smelling smoke and thinking, what, this is how it ends? Then I heard someone yelling my name. Her voice trembled slightly. Natalie climbed through broken glass without even thinking about herself. She kept telling me to look at her. Not at the blood, not at the smoke. She never let go of my hand. Mom, people don't fake something like that. I felt tears welling in my eyes. I know. Emma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I think Dad lied to both of you. That simple sentence carried more wisdom than I had managed to find in an entire year. A few days later, David called asking if he could stop by to see Emma. She agreed, though without much enthusiasm. I stayed in the living room while they talked on the back porch. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes, but I could tell from David's face when he walked back inside that it hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. Emma stood behind him with tears in her eyes. Dad, she said quietly, I can forgive you for leaving Mom. That's between the two of you. David looked relieved. But I can't forgive you for making me hate someone who risked her life for me. His face fell. I never asked you to hate her. No, Emma replied. You just made sure I never knew the truth. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but there was nothing left to say. As he walked toward the front door, I noticed how much older he looked than the man who had left our house a year earlier. The confidence he'd carried into his new life had disappeared, replaced by the weary expression of someone finally running out of excuses. Just before he stepped outside, he turned to me. I've made a mess of everything, haven't I? I looked at him for a long moment. No, David. You made a choice. And now all of us have to live with it. He lowered his head and quietly walked away. But because carrying it had become exhausting. After Emma went upstairs to finish packing, Natalie turned toward me. I've been meaning to tell you something. I waited. David and I broke up 6 months ago. I wasn't surprised. She gave a small, sad smile. The day after Emma came home from the hospital, I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Every conversation reminded me that 2 women had been living inside the same lie. She looked around the living room before continuing. I don't regret loving him. Then she shook her head. I regret believing that hurting another woman was the price of being loved. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I walked into the kitchen and returned with 2 cups of coffee. She looked at me, confused. I thought you hated coffee. I smiled. My husband loved coffee. I took a sip. I just never gave myself the chance. She laughed softly, and for the first time, it didn't hurt to hear it. As she stood to leave, she hesitated at the front door. I don't expect forgiveness. I looked at the woman I had spent years blaming for every tear my daughter and I had cried. Then I remembered the image that had haunted me ever since the hospital. Natalie, climbing through broken glass without stopping to think about herself, holding Emma's hand while waiting for the ambulance, refusing to leave her side until she knew my daughter would live. I stepped forward and hugged her. She froze in surprise before quietly hugging me back. You already earned it, I whispered. After she left, I stood on the porch, watching the evening sun disappear behind the trees. People often ask if I ever forgave David. The answer is yes. Not because he deserved it, because I deserved peace. Holding on to anger is like carrying a burning piece of coal and expecting someone else to get burned. The only person it destroys is you. The woman I hated most didn't ruin my family. The man I trusted did. She was simply another person trying to build a future with someone who had built that future on lies. Life taught me something I never expected. Sometimes the villain in your story is another victim, and sometimes the person who saves your child also saves your heart. That is why whenever people ask me about the hardest chapter of my life, I don't tell them about the affair. I tell them about forgiveness, because betrayal broke my family. But compassion gave me back something far more valuable. It gave me peace.